Check, check, check. Check, 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 check. Check, check, check.
Okay. We're down to T-2. So the final exam is next Friday. The final exam, I'll repeat this a couple different times, the final exam is going to look an awful lot like the midterm, except the final exam will have different questions on it than the midterm. It will not be cumulative, it will not be repetitive, repeating what was on the midterm, but it will look a lot like it in terms of the kinds of questions that are on there, how many questions are on there, and so on. You will have 2 hours for the final, not 3. You will have 2 hours for the final, but essentially the same number of questions as the midterm. So you'll have a lot more time per question to look at your first answer, decide you don't like it, erase it, switch to another answer, and switch back to the first answer, and back and forth until I say you have to stop. There will be a review session, but I don't know the exact time yet, but it will be early next week. I've put in a request for the folks who actually handle the scheduling to get that, and hopefully I will be able to tell you on Thursday, as well as send an email out to all of you through the Blackboard website. Tonight, 6 p.m., I will be doing the session on applying to graduate school and being prepared to apply to graduate school and sort of what to expect when you think about that process. That'll be tonight at 6 p.m., but not in this room. That'll be in Franz Hall, room 1178, the big room in Franz 1178. Okay. Any questions before we begin? My expectation is that the talk tonight will be podcasted audio. The only hesitation I have about that is because this and that are on the same day. There have been glitches in the past occasionally where one of the two things, that one probably, doesn't end up getting recorded, but they assured me that they have it worked out this time. So I hope it'll work, but you never know for sure until it's actually posted. Okay, so we have a lot to cover in our last remaining 2 hours and 27 minutes between today and Thursday. So I'm going to jump right in. We're going to finish off the judgment and decision-making lecture really quickly here. And now would be a good time for everyone to stop the murmuring, because now we're actually having lecture, and I'm not just talking about things that might not be relevant to you or the person sitting next to you. So we spent a good chunk of last time talking about 3 different heuristics: availability, representativeness, and anchor and adjustment. Okay. And so I want to talk a little bit more generally, just for a few minutes, about those to sort of make some sense of those, and then we're going to move on to the next lecture. So 25 years after all of those original findings were presented back in the 70s, the person who sort of generated those different heuristics, or the names of those heuristics, and demonstrated them, Danny Kahneman, he came up, after he got the Nobel Prize in 2003, 2004, somewhere around there, he came up with this idea to try to explain all the heuristics together. Okay? And this idea is what he calls attribute substitution. And I think it's a very, very powerful concept for making sense of these particular heuristics, but broadly beyond these heuristics. And the idea is it's very similar to what we always sort of think politicians do. When politicians are asked a question that's hard for them or that they don't know the answer to, they just answer another question that they really do know the answer to, that's easy to answer, or that they want to talk about. Okay? So they sort of do a switcheroo where they don't answer the question that's asked, they answer something else instead. And so what attribute substitution is the idea that sometimes when we're asked a question, something in our mind, something in our brain, okay, uses the answer to a question we haven't been asked to answer the question we have been asked. Okay? And what's critical about this is we don't know that that's happening in our mind. We think we're answering the real question most of the time, but sometimes we're not. And what he suggests is this tends to happen when generating the real answer would take a lot of work, and there's something else that kind of has the right structure or form to it that we can answer, that we use instead. And so the availability heuristic is a nice example of this. We're asked to generate, how many words have K in the third position versus words that have K in the first position. And that's a very hard sort of attribute to compute for the K in the third letter words, right? You want to compute the number of times each of these two things occur. That would be an attribute that you would consider. Okay? But that's hard to compute. But what's really easy to compute is how easily a few words come to mind when we go king, right? And we generate words that way. Okay? And so there's a general suggestion that this is something that our mind engages in. We answer one question instead of the one we're asked, and critically, we don't recognize that our mind is doing this, so that we're very confident in the answer we generate because we believe we've actually answered the right question. Now, okay, the reason I spent the time I did talking about these different heuristics and biases is because I think they relate to a lot of the biases and errors that we've seen in social psychology throughout the quarter and beyond what we've talked about in here, more generally in social phenomena. And these are just a couple of examples, a handful of examples, but I think you could apply what we know about these heuristics to a lot of the things that we see going on in social psychology. So when we talked about naive realism, right, we're basically prioritizing our own way of seeing things over somebody else's way of seeing things. And one of the things we know is that our own experience, our own immediate perspective, right, is much more available to us than anyone else's perspective. Okay? So we can partially understand what's going on in naive realism with this notion that things that are more available to us, right, seem more frequent, more right, more significant. Okay? Stereotyping, which we're going to talk about shortly, can easily be seen as a case, a very direct case of the representativeness heuristic. Okay? The representativeness heuristic is basically sometimes some pattern looks more like what we expect an overall reality to be, and we mistake one for the other. Now, in the case of stereotypes, as we'll see, a stereotype can be true when it's applied to a large group. Okay? So, for instance, the stereotype that basketball players are tall is true, right? That is undeniably true, no matter how you want to define things. But that does not mean that every single individual who plays basketball is tall. So the problem comes, okay, when we apply a stereotype, if it is true, to particular individuals, because then what we're doing is we're acting as if the law of small numbers is true. Right? So there are things that are true at a large population level, but we get into trouble when we say, oh, this is going to be true of 1, 2, or 3 particular instances in the real world. Okay? The fundamental attribution error. If you remember Dan Gilbert's model of where you automatically and immediately make a strong dispositional inference, and then if you are motivated and are not under cognitive load, okay, then you'll adjust that initial inference to make an inference that's more in line with what the situational constraint information tells you. Okay? This is literally taken right from the anchor and adjustment heuristic. You anchor on the behavior as an indicator of the disposition, and then if you have the resources free, you adjust. Dan Gilbert literally was reading Kahneman and Tversky and said, I bet I could apply that to make sense of the fundamental attribution error. Okay? I'm just not going to mention the last one because it's just another example. The idea here is that a lot of the social phenomena that we see can be partially understood in terms of these judgment and decision-making phenomena that aren't in themselves intrinsically social. So this kind of goes back to sort of the first day or two of class. Why do we have these biases? Why do we make these heuristic mistakes that we do? And the answer, which we'll come back to in our next lecture in a little bit more detail, is that these biases, these heuristics, simplify our world. Okay? William James once said, the world is a buzzing, blooming confusion. Okay? There is an infinite amount of stimulation, stimuli, coming into your senses at any one point in time. It's pretty much limitless. And the brain has to do things to cut through and simplify the information that's out there in the world. And so heuristics seem to be strategies that the brain has evolved to deal with all that information in a way that's relatively effective, even though it's not perfect. It's not always going to get the exact right answer, but it's going to be relatively effective. And so heuristics are often described as rules of thumb. And I always think it's worth pointing out that the rule of thumb, right, has a very specific historical meaning to it. Okay? If you go back to medieval times, the way they actually measured things in a kingdom was by taking the king's thumb and taking from where the knuckle was to the top of the thumb, and that was an inch. So that was the rule of thumb. That's how you measured what an inch was before they had standardized measurement systems. Okay? And within any given kingdom, this worked really well because you had one king who had one thumb, who had one distance from their knuckle to the end of their thumb. Okay? So this worked just fine most of the time. But it didn't work all the time. It didn't work when, say, one king was negotiating with another king to, like, buy some of their land. And that's because the other king has a different sized thumb, which means that when the other king tells you you're getting this many square inches of land, and then you go find out that it's half the size that you thought it was, it's because that thumb of that second king might be a lot smaller, and now you're getting screwed in the bargain. Okay? The king with the smallest thumb probably did very well at the bargaining table, but probably got into a few extra wars as a result. So these rules of thumb in this particular example are kind of showing what's true of most heuristics. In the right context, most of the time, they will serve our ends just fine. But there are times when they will get us into trouble and lead us into bad decisions, bad judgments, bad behaviors. And this is exactly the same as with visual illusions. Visual illusions reveal essentially the tricks that the visual system makes, sort of applies in order to make sense of the visual world around us. And most of the time, those tricks work remarkably efficiently and effectively for helping us navigate the visual world. But the tricks are limited, and they can be revealed through the use of visual illusions. Okay, so I just wanted to spend those 5 minutes or so talking about why sort of heuristics are really important to understand, even though they're not sort of intrinsically social. And now we're going to turn to something very different. Okay? I'm going to show you 4 people here, and I want you to just think to yourself, which of these men is a murderer? Okay, here we go. Okay, now the nervous laughter there could be for any number of reasons, but probably at least one of the reasons is that we have 3 very clean-cut looking Caucasian men here. And then probably for some of you, you had nervous laughter as you went, oops, I thought that guy is probably the murderer. Okay, maybe he is. We don't know. Well, actually, it turns out that all of these guys are murderers. This is, these are all people who have killed multiple people. Okay, the preppy murderer and Ted Bundy, probably one of our most famous murderers here in America. So they're all murderers, actually, except for this guy who's an award-winning kindergarten teacher from San Francisco. But the fact that you find that even funny, again, reveals some of the biases that we probably are all walking around with. Here's another advertisement that in some ways makes the same point. Which of these two people is more likely to have committed a crime? Right? After a few seconds, you realize, oh, it's the same person. Just different lighting. Okay? And this ends up having major consequences, not just in terms of these brief little immediate reactions, but in terms of life and death situations. So a few years ago, there was a study done looking at African Americans who were on trial where they could get the death penalty if they were convicted and a particular sentence was assigned to them. And what they found was that controlling for all other things in terms of severity of the crime and past records and so on, that African Americans were more likely to be sentenced to death if their face looked more stereotypically African American in terms of the color of their skin, in terms of various features on the face. Okay, they were 10% more likely to be sentenced to death, okay, based on their physical appearance when everything else was equivalent and controlled for. Okay, so that's pretty scary business when you see results along these lines. So what we're going to talk about for, unfortunately, less time than I would like to because we're all crunched up at the end of the quarter here, is stereotyping and prejudice. Okay? So we're going to spend some time talking about the definitions, and then we'll focus a bit on explicit stereotyping, implicit stereotyping, what it's like to be the target of stereotyping, and then explore a little bit why it is that we stereotype, what does it do for us psychologically, behaviorally, and so on. So there are a number of different definitions that have been applied over the years. The key thing is for us to just all have a particular definition that we're using for the sake of this lecture and, say, the exam next Friday. And so these are the definitions that we'll be applying here. Stereotypes refer to beliefs that associate a group of people with particular traits or characteristics. Okay? So if you think a group is lazy, intelligent, tall, athletic, creative, any group you want to assign as a group, if you think there's a general characteristic that can be applied to them, that is a stereotype. Okay? I have a stereotype that things that come in shapes that look like this tend to taste good and help keep me up at night. Okay? That's a stereotype. It's a trait that I assign to a class of objects or entities in the world. So this is a very cognitive description. This is the cognitive aspect of what are stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. Okay? They can be positive or negative. Okay? And the big question that often comes up is, can they be true? Okay? And if we had more time, we might have a big debate in here about whether or not they can be true or not. But I will just cut to the chase and tell you, yes, they can be true. But they're true when they're applied in the aggregate. Sometimes. Sometimes. Lots of stereotypes are just flat out false. Okay? So if I have a stereotype that horse riding jockeys are the tallest people in the world, right? That's just wrong. So I can have a stereotype that's wrong, but I can also have stereotypes that are accurate, like basketball players in the NBA are tall. That tends to be true. Even the short basketball players in the NBA tend to be taller than the average non-basketball player outside the NBA. Now, the problem with stereotypes, apart from the fact that they can be incorrect, and they often are incorrect, a major problem with stereotypes is when they are applied to individuals rather than to groups. Okay? So you might get some difference between men and women. So for instance, if you do tests of spatial working memory or spatial visual transformations, on average, men will do better than women. And you can test this in a 50 versus 50 person sample of men and women, and you can do that again and again and again, and almost every time you run that test, on that particular test, men will on average do better than women. But the distributions aren't that different from each other. So, if you've got the two distributions that have your bell curves, right, the bell curves kind of look like this. So the mean is a little bit different, but there are lots of people in the male distribution who are lower than lots of people in the female distribution. So if you look at a particular male or female, if you take one male and one female and say, I bet this man has better spatial working memory abilities than this woman, you are going to be incorrect a whole lot of the time. And a lot of the problems, although not all the problems with stereotyping, is the application of something that may be true at a group level and applying it at an individual level. Another problem with stereotypes is that we often make attributions about the source of those characteristics. Okay? So we often say that this group doesn't do as well on, say, the SATs, okay, because it's something about their nature. Okay? We can almost never make those judgments with sort of scientific support. Because there's so many other confounded variables. There's so many other socioeconomic status variables, dietary status variables, cultural variables that are typically confounded with the sort of biological nature of the group that is showing whatever effect that we're talking about. So we get into lots of trouble, not just when we say this group tends to perform differently than this other group, but when we say the reason why these groups perform differently is because this group is just inherently different than this group. That is usually taking a giant leap that we don't have the data to support because there's so many other confounding variables. Yep. No. He said, is that why men don't ask for directions? You mean because they believe that they're better or because they're actually better? Well, on average, right, men are better at spatial working memory, but no, men don't ask for directions, I think, and this is just another stereotype, because they don't want to look like they need help, right? I mean, I think that's the big difference. Let's put it this way. Asking for directions or not doesn't seem to be a function of how good a man's spatial working memory abilities are. Yeah. Okay. So, the second aspect of this literature is prejudice. Okay? And prejudice is about sort of your feelings or emotional reactions to a group or individual. Okay? So it's negative feelings or attitudes towards others because of their group membership. Okay? So this isn't about assigning traits. This is about I like or don't like. I feel comfortable or don't feel comfortable with members of whatever group. Okay? And then lastly, we have the behavioral aspect, which is discrimination. When you engage in negative behaviors towards others because of their group membership. There goes my mic. Okay, so these things often go hand in hand, right? We often end up having negative stereotypes of groups we feel negatively towards, who are also individuals that we might discriminate against in some way. But we could also separate out these things, and they don't necessarily have to go together at all. All right, so what I want to start by doing, just briefly, is talking about the idea of explicit stereotyping. And that's because the idea of explicit stereotyping has really been, up until the last 20 years or so, the main thing that's been examined. So an explicit stereotype, or explicit prejudice or discrimination, has to do with what a person can and will explicitly tell you in a self-report. Okay? So back in, I believe, 1933, at Princeton, they asked a bunch of people, to make judgments about black Americans. Okay, and these were all white participants making judgments about black Americans. They were asked how many of them endorsed each of these traits. Okay, each of these traits. Okay. And what you can see is that in 1933, a lot of people said, yes, African Americans are superstitious, lazy, happy-go-lucky, okay, and so on. They then asked again in 1967, 1993, okay, and they also asked, would you be willing to admit blacks to employment in your occupation, my club, and so on? Okay. And so there's a couple things to take away from this. One, this is all explicit self-report. This is what people are willing to say out loud, I would do, or how I feel, or what I think. Okay. A second thing to notice is that a lot of these numbers drop really dramatically as time has gone by. And for many folks, this is taken as a major sign of progress in the area of race relations. By others, and I think rightly so, it's also taken as evidence that people just know that they're not allowed to endorse these things, that it's not socially acceptable to say some of the things in 1993 that were acceptable to sort of endorse in 1933. Okay? We can also see that there's a difference between these traits, which are stereotypes, and these other descriptions down here, which really fall more into the category of prejudice and discrimination. Sort of how you feel about these groups and what you would be willing to do, or how close you would be willing to have them working with you, living with you, marrying into your family, and so on. Okay? So for a long time, this was the predominant way that we studied stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination. And then I think starting in the 70s, there started to be a formal realization that a lot of what's really going on is not going to be revealed through these kinds of explicit surveys. Okay? And there's two reasons for that. One reason it's not going to be revealed is because people don't necessarily want to tell you if they are biased or prejudiced in some way. Right? They may know it's socially inappropriate, and so they're simply not going to say it to some stranger who's surveying them, even if they, in their heart of hearts, know that they're biased in some way. But there's a second reason, and we've talked at length about these kinds of things in here, which is that people may not have introspective access to a lot of their own processes and responses. They may not be aware of their own biases, their own prejudice, their own stereotypes. Okay? I'm skipping some slides here on the minimal group paradigm, but I encourage none of you to go out and buy this book. I'm sure it's updated now with more than 303 reasons, but this in general highlights the fact that we don't just do this for race and ethnicity type issues. It's very easy for us to find any group to sort of distance ourselves from and say we like ourselves and don't like them so much. So for the last 25 years, last 30 years, the really big thing within the world of stereotyping and prejudice research has been work on implicit stereotyping, implicit prejudice and discrimination, and so on. And so we're going to do a brief demonstration here that I'm sure some of you have been in studies where you've done this before, but I think it's worth taking a moment or three to do it again here. And in order to do this demonstration, you're going to need to be able to take both of your hands and slap both of your thighs one at a time. Okay? So if there's anything blocking that, unblock. Okay. Okay. So what we're going to do here is very simple. Let's go through sort of the first version of this. This is called an IAT, which I'm sure, as I said, many of you have seen before. And in this, what you're going to do is very simple. Instead of using the left key and the right key on a computer keyboard, as we often do, you're going to use your left thigh and your right thigh to indicate left or right. And what you're going to do is, whenever you see a word that fits into the category of pleasant words, you're going to hit your left thigh. And when you see an unpleasant word, you're going to hit your right thigh. So if you are shown this list of words and I tell you to go through them, what you would do is you would hit left thigh for gentle, right thigh for rotten, and right thigh for failure. Okay? Pretty straightforward, pretty easy, right? All right. So now we're going to do something else that's quite similar. Instead of classifying words as pleasant or unpleasant, you're now going to classify names as stereotypically white or black. Okay. So, here, right, if you were shown this list of words, okay, for white you would hit your left thigh, and so for Sarah you'd hit your left thigh, for Susie you'd hit your left thigh, for Shaniqua you'd hit your right thigh, and for Rashonda you'd hit your right thigh. Again, very simple and straightforward. Okay? Now we're going to put these two together. Okay? And so what we're going to do on the next one is we're going to practice seeing a list of words that are not names intermixed with names, and whenever you see something that is either a pleasant word or a white name, you'll hit your left thigh. And whenever you see a word that's an unpleasant signifying word or an African American black name, you'll hit your right thigh. Okay? So we're going to go through this, and this time I want you to all sort of do it with me to sort of get some practice at it. So we'll do this. And so Sunrise, let's go ahead and hit left thigh, Sarah left thigh, Rotten right thigh, Shaniqua right thigh, Failure right thigh, Susie left thigh, Gentle left thigh, Roshonda right thigh. We'll get back to that. No, I'm the professor. You can put your hand down. I heard your question. We will get back to it. Trust me, I don't lead you astray. We will get back to it. All right? Now, okay, we're going to do this for real this time, where you are going to go through, okay, and when I show you the next list, okay, you're all going to do it as quickly as you can while being accurate. Okay? You're going to go through and do it as quickly as you can while being accurate. Okay? Is everybody ready? So, 1, 2, and when you are done going through the whole list, put your hand in the air and keep it there. Okay, so when you're done, hand in the air, keep it there. Okay, here we go. 1, 2, 3. Okay, so about half of you are done. Okay, you can all stop by around 16 seconds. Okay, now we're going to do it again, but I've switched something. I've switched where white and black are assigned. Okay, so now anytime you see a pleasant word or a word that's associated with a black name, hit your left thigh. And anytime you see an unpleasant word or a stereotypically white name, hit your right thigh. Okay? Are people ready? Okay, so here we go. Now remember, after you go through the next list, when you're done, raise your hand. Here we go. 1, 2, 3. Okay, so you can stop now. So, by my look at the clock, it looked like to get to about 50% of you being done, took about 24 seconds that time instead of 16 seconds the last time. Okay, now, for many of you, the reason why you started laughing pretty quickly into this list is because you immediately got an experiential understanding of what was going on here. Okay? For many of you, you realized in a very direct way that this is harder for most people to do. This is harder. Okay? This is harder because there's something about the way our minds are set up after being raised in the particular sort of cultural environment that we are raised in the United States. There is something that makes it harder for us to associate black and pleasant on the same sort of response or unpleasant and white on the same response. It's easier for our minds to make the opposite associations. And that is an indication of implicit stereotyping. That there is an implicit association that most of us would not consciously endorse, but is still there. Okay, so now let's take the hands that are up. Have you ever done the second first? At least 2,000 times. Yes. So yes. So the researchers who do this work, when you do it in the lab, every other subject gets it one way or the other. Of course, in here, I can't do it that way because I have to do it with all of you all at once. But yeah, absolutely. And they also make sure that you get lots of practice with each. Even though I didn't want to take the time to do that here, you get practice with each kind to sort of clear away, okay, well, I was doing it one way. Now you get to do practice with the new way before they time it and count it for the actual trials. Absolutely. They've switched which side it's on, and you still get the same effects. Yep, absolutely. Oh, do they see how accurate people are? Sure, and you get effects both of speed and accuracy, depending on sort of which of those things you emphasize. And in general, that's a general trade-off that you get with any cognitive processes, that you can encourage people to focus on one or the other. Way in the back. Sure. There's actually a website put together by Brian Nozick and Mahzreen Banaji that I think lives somewhere on a Harvard website, and on that website, I think now more than like 10 million people from around the world have taken different forms of the IAT. And one of the cool things about the IAT is you can make it up for any two things that you want to test an association on. So I did it here for white and black names, but we could have done things associated with being heavy or skinny. We could have done it associated with two soccer teams. We could have done it instead of pleasant or unpleasant. We could have done me and not me as the categories. And then you can look at how strongly a person has implicit associations between themselves and some category of things. So for instance, you could have done, for me, I would do me, not me, Macintosh, PC, and then show lots of words or pictures related to those two things. And I'm a Mac person, so I'd be a lot faster at doing me, Mac, than doing me, PC. Okay? So this is a really flexible tool that has been used incredibly widely. It has issues, but not the ones that are typically being raised in here. But it can be used to interrogate all sorts of different kinds of implicit associations. Yeah. Louder? Yeah, so good question. So what do African Americans tend to do on this? And what you see there is an attenuated bias relative to white Americans, but you still see a bias on average of African Americans being faster for white pleasant and black unpleasant. Okay? And what I think that's a sign of is that if you're raised in a particular culture, and we're all raised largely seeing the same images with similar teachers expressing similar unintentional biases, okay, we see the same movies. Okay, these things together end up shaping our implicit associations, and so you get something that's as paradoxical as that. Okay? Certainly, I don't think, as much as any white American most often would not consciously endorse these things, certainly we wouldn't expect black Americans to endorse these things, and they don't. But implicitly, those associations tend to be there albeit in weaker form.
Maybe part of the unpleasant association with the stereotype that blacks may have to endure more unpleasant situations.
Oh, no, that's not what's driving this. You can do it all sorts of different ways, but it's not. So you think the unpleasantness is because African Americans have endured more?
No, I'm not saying that that's the primary reason.
Yeah.
I mean, that's certainly.
Yeah, no, this works with anything where there's a general sort of assumption that there's some kind of negative bias, whether it's obesity or if you go to, Asian countries, you can just take like two rival groups that live right near each other and there's no sort of history of slavery or anything like that. You get the same effects. You can get these effects very robustly across all sorts of groups. You can get it with, if you like one basketball team and somebody likes another basketball team, you'll see the effects for that as well. It's a very robust phenomenon. Yeah? Right, so that's one thing that comes up. Black or white as a color instead of as a race. Now, I mean, the one thing that doesn't really make sense about that is I'm showing you names here which clearly point to the racial aspect of the words black and white. But some people have suggested that maybe this has something to do with the fact that historically there's been a negative connotation with the color black and a positive connotation with the color white, angels, snow, all that stuff. Angels and snow are both things that don't exist in Southern California. Yeah, I mean, one of the nice things about doing this kind of demonstration for anyone who's ever done it is it's a great way to teach a couple hundred people about good experimental methodology really quickly because people don't like the results of this, right? When anyone's been in the audience, they suddenly start thinking of all the things that might have been wrong with the studies that show this, okay? And so everybody always generates things like, well, did you start with the congruent or incongruent first? Was there some kind of left or right bias? Was there some color connotation? All the things that all of you are saying, okay? But there have been probably 250 papers published looking at every possible permutation of this. These effects are real, and they're pretty ubiquitous. Most people in here show them, although not all. There is a segment of individuals who show the reverse bias or no bias at all. Okay, but in general, this is something that pervades U.S. society. Okay. And the reason I show this is because this is one of the few ways you can assess implicit stereotypes where the person being assessed gets an immediate sense of what it's about. Okay? And I want you to have that sense because as with most things we talk about, we're not just talking about the people out there in the world. We're talking about us. And I'm talking about me. Okay? I have no doubt that if I took an IAT test right now, I would show this bias. Right? I hate that I would show that bias. I don't like the fact that that association is swimming around in my head. Okay? But we're not in charge of our implicit associations. You know who's in charge of our implicit associations? The society we grow up in. Our parents, our teachers, our family, everything that we're exposed to when we're growing up. They control our implicit associations. Go ahead and try and change one. You can't. Right? It's not something that you can just say, oh, I'm going to change my implicit associations. It doesn't work that way. Yeah. Yeah, so after this was well established, then the next big question was, well, can they be changed? Or to put it the way that I think most liberal-leaning folks would say, can it be fixed? And the answer is yes, but not easily or quickly. So essentially, these implicit associations are the result of conditioning. So you can do more conditioning. And there have been studies showing that if you, in the study that I'm thinking of, they actually weren't looking at black-white. They were looking at skinheads versus, I can't remember what the other group was. But essentially they had people, I think, see the word skinhead or see names or something, and then they had another thing that was sort of conditioned to be associated with that hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times. And then, yes, the original bias did get diminished or go away. So you can do it. I don't know how long those effects last. Maybe they last, maybe they don't. But it's not the kind of thing where someone can just decide to change them, at least as far as we know. Although I bet with hypnosis, if someone's highly hypnotizable, you could. But nobody's done that study yet. Yeah, right. So what happens if you essentially are using very positive exemplars from a group? And I believe there's some data showing that that does moderate the effect. It makes it diminish. It doesn't make the effect go away, but I think it does have some impact on the effect. And what that's doing, I mean, what that really highlights is a concept we talked about in the first half of the quarter, which is chronically accessible associations versus temporary primes, right? So there was that Barge study where we looked at what happened when you had a chronically accessible construct or association, and then you were primed with something that competed with that. And that's essentially what you would be getting, is temporarily you can get some effect of seeing a picture of Martin Luther King or some other very positively, some exemplar that's even considered very positive by the group that has the implicit stereotypes. Yeah. So the vast majority of the work that's been out there, that's been done, has looked at what's going on in the minds of the observers who are observing or thinking about these groups for which there are implicit stereotypes and sort of perhaps negative consequences within our society. It's only in the last 15 years or so that there started to be increasing work looking at what it's like to be the target of potential bias or prejudice. The most famous paradigm for looking at this, and the only one I'm really going to spend time on here because you should know about this one, but we don't have endless time, unfortunately, anymore, is a phenomenon called stereotype threat. Okay. So this is a concept that Claude Steele generated. Okay. And what he looked at was the effect of being in a stereotyped group on your performance in some way that was stereotype relevant. Okay. So I think the first big test of this was looking at how whites versus black students performed on a test like the SATs or GREs, a standardized test. Okay. And what they were interested in was whether for the African American students, the fear that one's performance on this test might in some way confirm the stereotype about you and your group could actually get in the way of you doing well on the test. Okay? So the idea is if you're an African American and you're thinking about the stereotype that African Americans don't do well on standardized tests, you might sort of be ruminating or in some way concerned about that in such a way to make it more likely to come true because you're distracted. Okay? So the critical thing here is that you have to believe that this test that you're about to take, okay, is actually relevant to confirming or not confirming that stereotype about your group. Okay? So, half of the subjects in their study were told that they were taking a test of intelligence, and that's clearly relevant to the stereotypes of whites versus blacks. But half the subjects were told that the task was unrelated to intelligence. They were told that, we're just testing out these items for later research. We don't actually care about how you perform. We care about, is this test a good test instrument or something like that. Okay? And so what they found is that when the white and black subjects didn't believe their own intelligence was on the line, we see no difference. But when the black and white subjects believed this was a genuine test of their intelligence, there was a giant reduction in the performance of the African American subjects. They did worse after sort of thinking about the ways in which this might be relevant to them and their stereotype and confirming the stereotype. So, out of fear that they might confirm their stereotype, they're actually in some way confirming the stereotype. And one of the points of all this that I think Claude Steele and others were trying to make is that when we see that there are differences on standardized test scores for whites versus blacks, this might be a big part of it. Because we all tend to believe that at some level those are intelligence tests. And so if we all believe that, and for some folks thinking about that is going to literally impair their performance, that may be why we're seeing this impaired performance. It's exactly like a self-fulfilling prophecy. And it's great that you say that because the part of the rest of the lecture for today is on self-fulfilling prophecies. Yeah. Yes. How does this relate to Trivial Pursuit? I don't know how it relates to Trivial Pursuit. But yeah, there's really interesting work that's actually been done. I'll just tell you about one study quickly that's been done with Asians and whites who are, the study I'm thinking of was done, and this was actually done by Margaret Shi, who's now at our business school. She's a professor in our business school, but she and I went to graduate school together a million years ago, and she did this study when we were in graduate school that actually was very, very important, where she took Asian American men and women, and they were either made to think about their gender or their ethnicity. Okay? If they were made to think about their gender, then men did better. I'm going to get some. I've already gotten some detail of this study wrong. I'm mixing together different studies. So, okay, the key thing about the study, because I'm not going to give you all the results because they're going to be wrong, is that if you take Asian American women and you prime them with their gender, they will do worse on math, better on verbal tests, and if you prime them with their ethnicity, they will do better on math and worse on the verbal tests because of the differing stereotypes of Asian versus American and male versus female. So yeah, this applies not just to black and white. It's really not even about black versus whites per se. It's about any group being aware of the possibility of a performance confirming their stereotype. It's been somewhat elusive to figure out what's really going on in these stereotype threat effects. There's multiple accounts that have been given. One that I'm particularly fond of, just given my own interest, is work by Toni Schmader, where she put people under stereotype threat or not. So this was a study with women or men who were either put under stereotype threat with respect to, I don't know, maybe their math performance ability. And what they found is that when women were under stereotype threat, in this case, their working memory performance got worse. And this is consistent with the idea that you're distracted thinking about the possibility of confirming the stereotype, being anxious about it. If that's reducing your working memory capacity is critical to all sorts of different kinds of test taking. So if that's being limited, you're essentially being put under cognitive load. And I think that that's a really nice piece of data to this end. Yeah?
I was just curious if you're familiar with any studies in other cultures, because it seems like the stereotyping of women in math is somewhat cultural.
Oh, it is. Right. No, so that's a study that was done here in the U.S. Okay? So yeah, no, it totally depends on what the stereotypes are in the culture you're living in. So there's other places in the world where white versus black doesn't mean anything at all. Okay? But it means a lot here in the United States. So you see those effects here. In other parts, in Afghanistan or Pakistan, there's literally like hill-by-hill groupings where they speak different dialects, and there you might get effects based on, two different versions of Pashtun or something like that, that to us we go, well, what's the difference? They're all the same, right? And so I think that, you have to be very sensitive to sort of where in the world you're running this and where the stereotypes are actually relevant. So these folks are, I think, doing they believe they're going to do a math test, and their gender is made salient to them, and so that's going to put women under stereotype threat more than men. Okay. This is just called the stereotype threat condition, but really it's just the you're taking a math test that's diagnostic of your math ability condition. So that's not really an appropriate label. I think what they would say is this is really the only group that's under stereotype threat in this study. I think you're right to pick up on that. Sorry. Yeah. Right. No, I think there is some evidence of anxiety, but this has been a tricky thing to sort through. I don't think the data is ever as clear as people really want it to be. What I can say is people have looked down a lot of different avenues, and the evidence tends to be mixed. They don't have it all sorted out. And I don't know that they would call it stereotype threat if they were renaming it today. That's what they named it in their first study, and since it was one of the probably 5 most important papers of the last 20 years, it stuck. Yep. Yeah. In fact, in this case, they never even took a test. So they never got to the math test. They were just told, you're going to take a math test. Okay? And then they were actually given a working memory test to see if thinking about the fact that you're going to take this diagnostic or non-diagnostic math test, does that affect your general working memory capacity? And it does for women in this one condition. Okay. So why do we stereotype? There have been 2 major kinds of accounts of why we stereotype, a cognitive account and a motivational account. And we've seen these kinds of accounts before in here, right? Why do people engage in the false consensus effect? Why do people think that they have done all the chores in their house? We can come up with cognitive and motivational accounts of a lot of these things. So the cognitive account makes sense in the context of the heuristics and biases we were just talking about in the last lecture. Where there's this idea that these stereotypes, okay, they save cognitive effort. They make it so that our mind doesn't have to work so hard, and they simplify the world. They take what's fundamentally ambiguous in the world and make it more sort of straightforward and concrete, unambiguous. Okay? And nobody's arguing that it does this without potentially making mistakes. But the question is, why would the brain be set up to stereotype at all? And one answer is, it saves mental effort and makes the world less ambiguous, makes the world easier to navigate. The motivational account, on the other hand, essentially has to do with, I want to feel good about myself, and so we know how social comparisons work. If I can find groups that I think are less good, then by comparison, I'm better. So I don't have to change what I believe about myself at all. If I can just find other groups to say those groups have whatever negative characteristic, then I'm better by comparison. And with motivational accounts in general, one way you find out if these motivational accounts work is you see whether the general effect you're interested in gets stronger when a person is threatened. Because when your ego is threatened, when your identity is threatened, you are more motivated to do things to affirm your identity, to make yourself feel good. So, I'm going to show you one study on this, one study on this, and then one study on that. There are hundreds of other studies, but we don't have time for that, so we'll do one of each. So, this idea that we don't like expending a lot of cognitive effort, that we don't like using our reflective conscious processes, is a notion that's been referred to as people are cognitive misers. Misers are people who like to sort of hoard things and not use them up. So like someone who's a financial miser wants to like keep all their money and not share with anyone else. So a cognitive miser would be someone who wants to sort of hoard their sort of reflective conscious resources and not use them any more than they need to. Essentially, it's someone who wants to be lazy. I don't want to be any less lazy than I have to be. It hurts to think, so I'm not going to do it any more than I need to. Okay? And so stereotypes can help in this endeavor because they're categorizations that make life more efficient, obviously, though, sometimes at the expense of accuracy. Now, this notion of the cognitive miser and the fact that stereotypes help make us more efficient has been assumed probably since Gordon Allport's famous book in the 1950s, The Nature of Prejudice. It's sort of the big book historically on prejudice, so if you're interested in that, that's the book to start with. But it's been assumed and not tested until Neil McRae in 1994 ran an experiment which, to my mind, is the first really serious test of this idea. Now, this is a complicated study, and so I'm going to try to take the time it needs to go through it clearly. Imagine you're a subject and you come in and you are told that you're going to see a bunch of adjectives about this person named Julian. Okay, so these are a bunch of adjectives that ostensibly describe this person named Julian. Okay. And I think you're even told you're going to need to remember what you can about Julian. Okay. Now, simultaneously, while you are listening to that description seeing these words that describe Julian, so they're going to be on a computer screen, you're going to be wearing headphones. Okay? And in those headphones, you are going to be hearing a geography lesson. Okay? So you're seeing adjectives that describe Julian on the screen, and in your headphones, you're hearing about geography. Okay? And at the end, you're basically going to have to answer questions about both of these things. Questions about Julian, questions about the geography lesson that you heard. So we're interested in what people learn about Julian. And from a social psych perspective, the geography lesson is just a way to make people cognitively busy, to make them distracted. Okay, now there's two more key variables that you need to understand this study. One is that half of the subjects get one additional sort of pre-bit of information about Julian. They're told he's an artist. Okay? We have stereotypes about artists. Right? Not all stereotypes are about race, ethnicity, age, gender, and so on. We have them about artists. And half of the subjects don't get any description of Julian's occupation or anything like that. Nothing where you could easily come up with a stereotype about Julian. Okay? And then the second key additional thing you need to understand is that all the trait words they're going to see about Julian are in two categories. Half of the trait words fit the artist stereotype, words like creative. Okay? Now this is true whether the subject gets the stereotype up front or not. So everybody gets the same list of words, but some of them have seen the stereotype. So half the words are stereotype consistent, and half the words are just other random traits that aren't inconsistent with being an artist, they're just irrelevant to it. So words like tall. Tall has nothing to do with artist or not an artist. Okay? So, what happens? Let's look first at how many of the trait words people can remember about Julian. And remember, some people know he's an artist, some don't, and everybody gets some words that are artist consistent, and everybody gets some words that are artist irrelevant. Okay. So for the people who don't know the stereotype, that don't know that Julian's an artist, they show pretty crappy memory performance all around. They don't remember many of the words that they saw about Julian. And when people get the stereotype label, they still don't remember many of the words that were irrelevant to artist, words like tall. Okay. But when they're given the stereotype label that he's an artist, okay, they do a pretty good job of remembering traits that are stereotype applicable. Okay? Traits associated with Julian being an artist. Okay? So this looks like having the stereotype made people better able to remember these characteristics. Okay? So it looks like it enhanced their memory performance. But here's the really amazing thing. Remember, we're talking about, do stereotypes make us more efficient? So what I've shown you so far is how these folks did at remembering the trait words about Julian. Remember, they also had this geography lesson that they were hearing in their headphones. And the general rule of how cognitive load works is if you have two conscious reflective processes, the better you do on one, because you're attending to it more, the worse you will do on the other. That's how things generally work in the world. Except here. Here, the same people who did best at remembering trait words about Julian also did better on the geography test. Okay? This means that knowing that Julian was an artist made them more efficient at remembering what was going on with Julian and gave them more mental resources free to pay attention to the geography lesson. They didn't have to work as hard to remember things about Julian because they had a stereotype to efficiently organize the information, and as a result, they could pay more attention and remember more about the geography lesson. So these folks did better at both tasks that they were simultaneously focusing on when they had the stereotype label that could organize the information. And that's what these two things say. The last point here is that the study 2 from this same paper that replicated study 1 never told people Julian is an artist. Instead, they subliminally primed people with Julian is an artist. And what they found is same exact results. So even when people don't consciously know that Julian's an artist, simply having the representation of artist active organized, efficiently organized people's memory for stereotype consistent trait words from Julian. So these folks, if you ask them at the end, what does Julian do for a living? I don't know. But they're still showing the effects as if they do know. Okay, that's a pretty powerful finding, and I think it really demonstrates that these stereotypes increase our efficiency so that we can focus on this less and have more attention free to focus elsewhere. Okay, second study from the cognitive end of the explanations. And this one comes from Ziva Kunda, who unfortunately passed away not that many years after running this study. She was quite young for someone to pass away, but she was very big in this literature until then. And she did a study looking at kind of the ambiguity-reducing effects of stereotypes. So she had subjects read about one person hitting another person. But the person who did the hitting, okay, varied. Okay, and the kind of hitting description varied as well. So there were 6 conditions in this study. People either saw a sentence that said, so-and-so hit someone who annoyed him or her, or they saw the sentence, decked a neighbor, punched a neighbor who teased him or her, or spanked a child. He or she spanked a child. So there are these 3 different things that they could see in terms of the action being described, and then in each case they were told that the person doing the hitting, spanking, punching was either a construction worker or a housewife. And guess what? We have stereotypes about both of those. And so what they looked at was subjects' ratings of how aggressive, how hostile the act was that was described. So the question is, when you see a housewife decked a neighbor who teased her, how aggressive do you think that is compared to when you hear that a construction worker decked a neighbor who teased him? So there's a couple interesting things about this. First, okay, so 2 of these descriptions are unambiguous. It's pretty unambiguous what happens here, decked a neighbor. That's clearly an aggressive, hostile response, right? You shouldn't punch someone for teasing you. But spanking a child is clearly a low aggression event in most cases. That's what we typically think, certainly what we thought, almost 20 years ago. Maybe times have changed. And so what's interesting is when the event itself is pretty unambiguous, we don't actually describe the level of aggression being different for construction workers or housewives. We don't need to apply the stereotypes because it's unambiguous how hostile that event is. But the first description was just he hit someone who annoyed him. And we don't know how the annoyance occurred. We don't really know what's going on there. It's much more ambiguous. And so when we look there, we see a dramatic split depending on whether or not the person doing the hitting is the construction worker or the housewife. Okay? And the reason is because this is ambiguous, and when an event is ambiguous, right, we use other factors to help make sense of what the event actually is. Okay? You engage in subjective construal. And stereotypes are one of the things that we can use to facilitate our subjective construal. See, the key thing is that when people imagine a housewife hitting someone who annoyed her, right, you might imagine her sort of like slapping someone kind of gently on the face. And when you imagine the construction worker hitting someone who annoyed him, right, you imagine like an all-out brawl. You imagine him like kicking and fighting and hurting the other person. So we imagine different events, and as a result of that, we assign different levels of aggression to them. Okay, so this highlights something that I told you, I think, on the first day of class, which is that social psychological factors, context, schemas, expectations, stereotypes, are more important and powerful for interpreting ambiguous than non-ambiguous stimuli and situations. The more ambiguous the norms of a situation are, the more likely you are to bring your own expectations and biases to bear to make sense of that. The more things are spelled out in the situation, the more we're all going to tend to see it the same way. Okay? Ambiguous things are fundamentally less spelled out for us. So here, in the ambiguous condition, the object of judgment, the thing you're trying to make sense of, the act of hitting, changes as a function of the stereotype of who was doing it. Okay, and we discussed that. All right, the last study from these three that I'm going to mention really quickly, okay, is a study on the motivational side of things. Okay? And in this study, they start by basically threatening your ego or not. They start by making you fail at an anagrams test or not failing at an anagrams test. And then they either prime you with the Asian stereotype or not. And the way they did this in this particular study was by having the research assistant being Asian or not. Okay? And the idea is if you're interacting with someone Asian, that's going to activate the Asian stereotype, compared to if you're interacting with a research assistant who's Caucasian, that won't activate the Asian stereotype. And then what they looked at was how people completed words like this, S blank O-R-T. Okay? And there's an Asian stereotypical ending to that, short, and there's a non-Asian stereotypical ending to that, sport. And they have lots of words like this, where you could either fill it out in a more or less stereotypical way, and they do all sorts of things to make sure they're picking the right words to be looking at here. And so what they were interested in was, how frequently do you see these stereotypic completions when someone has simply said, fill it in with the first thing that comes to mind? Now, if somebody gets positive feedback and is told you did well in the anagrams test, you see some effect of priming from the Asian assistant, where that prime leads them to use somewhat more of these Asian consistent prime completion words. So they'll tend to use short rather than sport a little bit more. But what if your ego has just been threatened because you failed at the test and were told you did miserably at it? The effect gets much larger then. Okay? So this is suggestive of people engaged in some kind of motivational process to try to make themselves feel better by derogating others. So by making others sort of seem less positive to me, more negative, I feel better about myself. And I think these subjects are unaware that they're doing this. But something in our brain responds to the motivation to repair our own self-image by engaging in more negative stereotyping of other groups. Okay, when we come back next time, we'll start by talking about Clever Hans. Today, 6 p.m., Franz Hall, 1178, not this room, is where I'll be doing the session on going to graduate school. See you there or see you on Thursday.